This is part two of the reading of the book entitled Pontius Pilate and the Jews, condensed from a book, Autobiography of G. Pontius Pilate by C.M. Franzero. And we left off with Pontius Pilate's description of the Passover celebration in Jerusalem in his day. And so we'll pick it up on page 42. Passover is an annual festivity for which I can hardly find a comparison in our religious celebrations. I can only compare it with our Lupercalia, but with this great difference that while for us the Lupercalia are an annual celebration of life and the joy of living in its most material sense, the Passover instead is considered by the Jews as a sacrament, not only to commemorate a national deliverance, the quote, passing over of Israel by the destroying angel, but to secure the same mercy for everyone. The celebration is a household sacrifice, and the head of each family kills a male lamb and sprinkles its blood on the lintel and doorposts as an expiation for the family as a whole. At Passover week, it used to be said that as many as 2 million or more people were in Jerusalem. Every house was crowded with pilgrims, and the whole countryside was covered with tents and booths made of mats or interwoven leaves, and also of wicker work. The pilgrims came from all parts of Judea, dressed in all the costumes of the East, Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and Mesopotamians, with their long trains of camels and mules, from Cappadocia, Pontus, Phrygia, and Pamphylia, from Egypt, the headquarters of foreign Jews, and from Libya and Cyrene, and from Arabia. Even from Rome they came, after a sea journey to Joppa or Caesarea. Here Pontius Pilate is confirming the fact that Judahites had spread all over the Greco-Roman world and were living among the Romans, among the Cappadocians, as far east as Babylon and other countries, he says Mesopotamia, Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and indeed this is where the Israelites came for the Feast of Pentecost in 33 AD, whom Peter addressed as ye men of Israel. So again, you can't confuse Judahites with Edomite Jews. These are two completely different genomes, and you have to understand that by the time that Pilate arrived on the scene, these Edomite Jews had taken total political control of Judea thanks to the Romans. Let's continue. This vast number of pilgrims reaches the city in time for the eve of the feast. That is on the 14th of Nissan. Naturally enough, many people take the opportunity to make a business visit to the city and therefore arrive earlier. Bridges and roads far and near have to be put in good repair for the occasion. All the graves near the routes of travel are carefully fenced in, and the headstones are whitewashed for the occasion, so that they may be seen from afar, and pilgrims might be warned lest they might be defiled by coming into contact with a place of burial. Even the fields are anxiously examined to see that they have not been made unclean by plants which the law forbids. Vast flocks of sheep are driven to the city so that the pilgrims might choose male lambs of 1 year and without blemish to eat at the feast. I was surprised to see the abundance of gifts and offerings that flowed to the temple for the Passover. Every Jew over 20 must send his didrachma every year from any part of the world in which he might be living for the upkeep of the temple. In every town of Palestine there is a chest for the sacred money, and into this the dues are put, and at a fixed time a band of chosen men carry the chest to Jerusalem. Even Egypt, though it has a temple at Leontopolis, sends this yearly tribute regularly, and it comes to Jerusalem also from Rome and from all the west, from Lesser Asia and from Syria. But the richest stream comes from Babylon and the countries beyond the Euphrates, whence it is escorted to Jerusalem by thousands of men and defended by them from the plundering Parthians on the way. So here you can see These would not be Jews. These would not be Edomites. These would be Judahites who so faithfully collect money to send to Jerusalem. But it's also obvious that these same Judahites spread out into the Greco-Roman world do not yet understand that Judea has been taken over by these Edomites. Let's continue. In the temple, in the court of the women, there are 13 chests called shopharoth, which are shaped like trumpets or cornucopias, broadening towards the mouth and adorned with inscriptions, and into these are cast all the offerings and contributions. The wealthy donors are always ostentatious in their offering of gold and silver, but no one can offer less than 2 pentas, the very smallest of current coins, for it is not lawful to offer only one. There is even a special coin used for the small offerings, which can be obtained from the money changers in the outer court, as it would be unlawful to drop into the chests a heathen coin showing the emblems of Rome. This coin is called a shekel. Now here we have a Babylonian tradition foisted upon Judah by the Babylonians and Edomites, where money changers never existed in Old Testament times. Let's continue. All this money is supposed to be spent upon the upkeep and services of the temple, but actually it forms a treasury in the hands of the priestly caste. The shekel is described by the priest as a voluntary tax, but if it is not paid by each and all by the 25th of the month of Adar, the temple collectors go from house to house and take security for it from the defaulters. In every town of Judea there are bankers or shulchanim to whom this tax is paid, usually on the 15th of Adar. Of course, this is in violation of Yahweh's law, which says that all these offerings must be voluntary. They are never collected by force. Continuing. The feast of the Passover commences on the 14th day of Nissan, which actually, according to the Jewish calendar, starts at sunset of the 13th. From that hour, no particle of leavened bread must be left in any house. The head of each family, as the evening closes, begins the household purification, and in rigorous silence proceeds to search each room, gathering every crumb that can be found. In the morning, he makes a further search for any liquid or solid food of fermented grain and for all dishes and vessels that have held it, and brings them outside the house. All vessels to be used by the household at the feast have to be cleansed with prescribed rites. For instance, metal dishes, after being scoured, must be first dipped into boiling water, in a pot used for no other purpose, and then into cold water. Iron vessels must be made red hot, then washed in the same way. Iron mortars for crushing corn into flour are filled with red coals till a thread tied outside is burned through. No clay dish can be used at all if not quite new, which causes a brisk trade in cheap pottery, specially made and bought for the feast. Personal purity is also as strictly enforced. Every man must cut his hair and nails and take a bath, which, among a people which differs from ours so much in this respect, and considers public baths as a heathen institution, is a great blessing. Now this is very telling, folks, because throughout history, medieval Jews have been known as filthy, stinking people. Why, when and where did these Jews lose their habit of cleanliness? The fact is they never had it, and they only have it in modern times as they have become very wealthy. Let's continue. I cannot recall to mind all the other rites for preparing the unleavened bread and other food, which are a most complex ritual. Anyway, on the afternoon of the 14th, the trumpets made of ram's horn are sounded from the temple to announce the beginning of the feast. And at the sound of it, everyone takes his lamb to the temple to be blessed and killed. In a few hours, the courts, the walls of which are hung for the occasion with gay carpets and tapestries, are simply packed with the most motley crowd imaginable. All the animals are examined by the priests, of whom there is a specially large number in attendance, to see that the beasts are without blemish. Then they are slaughtered and prepared for roasting. All this is done amidst indescribable haste and confusion, for it is no joke to examine and kill almost at the same time some 250,000 lambs. For the time for slaying the victims is between the evenings, that is, from sunset of the 14th till the star appears, though the animals may be actually killed in the last 3 hours of the day. I remember the high priest Caiaphas once telling me that the number of lambs slain at the Passover had been no less than 256,500, allowing an average of 10 persons to each lamb. The number of worshippers congregated into the city must have been no less than 2,700,000, exclusive of foreigners, but I think this was rather an exaggeration. As soon as the courts fill, the gates are closed on the multitude within, each holding his lamb in his arms. 3 blasts of trumpets then announce the beginning of the heavy task. Long rows of priests with gold and silver bowls stand ranged between the altar and the victims, to catch the blood and pass it from one to the other, till the last priest pours it upon the altar, whence it runs off through the pipes underneath. When the lamb has been drained of blood, the head of the family takes it to the hooks on the walls and pillars, where it is opened and skinned. The tail, which in the sheep of Palestine is very heavy, and the feet are handed to the priests and passed on till they reach the altar, to be burned as an offering. The lamb is then carried away in its skin, which afterwards is to be given to the host in whose house the feast might be held. No fewer than 10 may sit down at a company. Women can join their household, and even slaves, that is, indentured servants, and foreigners can eat the Passover, that is, foreigners of the same race, if they are circumcised. Everything is hurried, for the lamb must be killed, roasted, and eaten between sunset and 12 at night. For this purpose thousands of fires are prepared in special ovens. For the lambs may only be roasted, trussed with spits of pomegranate wood, inserted in the form of a cross, and roasted whole. If any flesh is left on the carcass after the supper, it is burned forthwith, so that it might not be defiled. Not a bone of the lamb must be broken, nor must any part of it touch the oven. The company, having assembled after the lamps have been lighted, arrange themselves in due order on couches round the tables, reclining on their left sides. A cup of red wine mixed with water is filled for every guest and drunk after a benediction by the head of the house. A basin of water and towel are then brought in, that each might wash his hands before touching the food. At last, a table is carried into the open space between the couches, and bitter herbs and unleavened bread, together with a dish of dates, raisins, and other fruits mixed with vinegar to the consistency of lime, are set on it along with the lamb. The host takes some of the bitter herbs, dips them in the dish, and after giving thanks to God for creating the fruits of the earth, eats a small piece and gives one to each of the company. A second cup of wine and water is poured out, and the youngest son of the house asks what is the meaning of the feast. This too is a ritual, and the whole story of the deliverance from Egypt is recounted year after year at every Passover table. This is how the Passover feast has been described to me, for of course I have never partaken of one, it being exclusively reserved to persons of the way. Of course, the Jews have adopted these habits in order to impersonate Israel, but this is what the Judahites did. Not lightly did Paul accuse the Judahites of being too steeped in ritual and not obeying Yahweh's laws the rest of the time. Let me continue. Not really a feast as we intend it, but rather a religious meal. At midnight the gates of the temple are once more opened, and the people, who seldom sleep at night, pour in their holiday dress with their thank offerings of food. The priests keep part and return the rest to the offerers, who have it cooked in one of the courts, and sit down to a second meal in the temple precinct. Or they carry it to certain parts of the town within the limits of which it is lawful to eat such food. The feasts last nearly a week. There is a day of rest. Then on the third day, the first fruits of the harvest are brought from the Kidron Valley to the temple, to be waved before the altar. And as soon as the sheaf of corn has been offered, the streets are filled with sellers of bread made of new barley and all sorts of fruits. After the 17th, many people begin to leave Jerusalem, but many others remain to make merry till the 21st. The priestly part of the Passover, although I could never witness it, is, I was assured, of great ceremonial interest. The priests required for the services have to assemble the previous evening in the great fire chamber of the temple. The keys of the temple and of the forecourts are handed to them by their relieved brethren. And besides the priests, there are 24 representatives of the Judahite nation. The vessels and utensils needed for the service, numbering 93, are carried beforehand to a silver table to the south of the great altar. The doors of the sanctuary are taken down and placed by the priests who have charge of them in a recess placed by the priests who have charge who've covered by a marble slab which the priest kisses before replacing, and he lies down to sleep upon it throughout the night. Towards the dawn, the captain of the watch and some priests, preceded by torch-bearers, take the keys and make a round of the courts to see that all is safe and in its right place. Meanwhile, the other priests rise, bathe, and put on their white robes. Their duties are fixed by lot, taken by counting a given number from any part of the circles formed by the standing priests, the choice remaining with him whose place makes up the figure. The gates of the temple are then opened by the Levites, with their peculiar headdress and an outside pocket containing a small roll of the law. The priests blow their trumpets 3 times, which is the actual signal to awaken the citizens, notwithstanding that early dawn is sounded by the garrison in Antonia. The altar is cleansed, and the services of the day begin, all this being done by torchlight before dawn. At the tinkling of a bell, a priest enters the holy place, takes away the censer last used, praying and walking backward as he retires. The blood of a lamb is sprinkled on the 4 sides of the altar as soon as the priests reappear. A second priest extinguishes 5 of the 7 lamps of the golden candlesticks. A third one takes in a glowing censer and lays it on the altar and retires, walking backwards. A fourth priest goes in, hands the censer to an assistant, shakes incense on the coals, prays, and retires. The 2 remaining lights are then extinguished. The slain lamb is skinned, the bowels taken out and washed, the body cut in 9 pieces, laid on a marble slab and salted. The meat is mixed with oil, strewn with incense, and a measure of wine is poured into a costly cup. It is now sunrise. As the sun rises, the 9 pieces of the sacrifice are lifted by 9 priests and carried to a great altar in order and laid on it. Salt and incense are added, and a handful thrown on the altar fire. 12 cakes representing the bread offering of the high priest are next burned, after being strewn with salt. The priest pours the wine of the drink offering into a silver funnel set in the altar, through which it runs into a conduit underneath. When the architects had completed their survey and given me their plans, I sent for the high priest and informed him that I had decided to build the aqueduct, and put it to him that the cost should be defrayed by the temple, as I did not intend to throw the burden of it upon the people by an increase of taxation. The aqueduct, I said, was to be entirely for the benefit of Jerusalem and of the temple in particular. The city, I pointed out, was supplied with water only by a few wells. That might be enough for the normal population of some 50,000 inhabitants, but at the time of their holy celebrations the pilgrims increased the population enormously, and the temple needed water for drinking and for their ceremonial washing. The temple, I said, derived an immense revenue from the compulsory contribution of the shekel made by every male adult of the community, a contribution that amounted to nothing better than a tax, which was extracted from the people with the tacit consent of Rome. It was only natural that the temple should use part of its vast treasure to pay for the building of an aqueduct. Caiaphas's answer was typical of the Jewish mind, and he being an Edomite. The only thing that interested him was not the news that they would have a first-class water supply, but who should pay for it. He objected that the revenue of the temple was in the largest part absorbed by the cost of the daily sacrifices and the upkeep of the fabric of the temple and the salaries of its large clergy. Quite true, I said, but a considerable surplus surely remained in the coffers year after year, constituting what was often mentioned as the fabulous treasure of the temple. Besides, if the cost of the aqueduct was not defrayed by the idle treasure of the temple, it would fall harshly upon the local community in the form of increased taxes. I said as much to Caiaphas, and I made it quite clear that although I considered it imperative that the temple should pay for the aqueduct, I had no intention of raiding the funds forcibly. The money must be handed out openly. So you can see that Pontius Pilate had sympathy for these people, even though he was confused and somewhat alarmed by the rituals. After interminable negotiations, the priests handed over the money, but in their customary underhand way, they used the occasion to stir up the people. When the Feast of Tabernacles occurred, and I came to the city purely out of courteous respect for the celebrations, and because I thought it wise to show the high priest my appreciation of the way the finance for the aqueduct had been settled, the people besieged my residence and demanded that the work be abandoned, as the money of the temple was korban, that is, consecrated to God. During the night, seditious words against me as representative of the emperor were scrawled over the walls of the palace, and in the morning the crowd attempted again to repeat the tactics they had used at Caesarea 3 years before. This time, however, I felt that a lesson was necessary. The troops had received orders to scatter the crowd using the scabbards of their swords. The populace fled amidst great din and terror and took refuge in the precincts of the temple. The troops, irritated probably by this baffling way the Jews always had of escaping punishment by running behind a holy shrine, invaded the temple and meted out a well-deserved beating. Of course, the priest cried out that it was an unprecedented outrage, and every breast in Judea swelled with the wildest of indignation. The excitement echoed even in the palace of Antipas of Tiberius. But I went stubbornly on with the aqueduct. I had made up my mind that the aqueduct would be remembered as my most useful work as a Roman procurator of Judea. I took a deep interest in the work's progress. Laborers were assembled from all the surrounding regions. But it was strange that the only place from which I could get no workmen was the very place which was to benefit. The people of Jerusalem would have nothing to do with the aqueduct. After a while, however, I began again to grow anxious about the costs, which were proving much higher than originally estimated. Apart from the laborers, who were paid regularly, there were big sums of money to be paid to the contractors. I approached the Sanhedrin again, and they replied, quote, "Water for drinking is of no real importance. The only water that matters is that for the soul. Water for the ablutions ordained by the law, and the temple has plenty of water for its own use," unquote. Well, yeah, the temple does. What about the rest of the city? Continuing, the position was getting laughable. I don't suppose that in any other province would the governor have been confronted with such a situation. Time dragged on, and the priest kept arguing that the building of an aqueduct was an imperial affair, and that the imperial treasury should pay for it. The temple, they said, was amply supplied by the wells, and there was absolutely no need to change what had gone on since time immemorial. At that I lost patience. I informed them that the money must be found without delay. The priests applied their usual passive resistance. Some days later I seized the temple treasure. To be truthful, I was much more modest and more cautious. I did not want to court a battle or even a conflict with the priests, and even less a delegation to Rome clamoring that I had violated the sacred precincts of the temple and robbed its treasure. I simply seized some of the tributes which are yearly sent to the temple from the Jewish communities or Judean communities all over the world. This tribute is usually brought in during early spring, mostly in currency and some in gifts of silver and gold plate. I missed Egypt's contribution, which is usually a fat one, but I plunged in time to seize the contribution of the Asiatic cities that was waiting at Caesarea, and that of the region of the Euphrates. I confiscated the chests at Caesarea, and when the procession carrying the donations from the Euphrates arrived in Jerusalem, my commandant for the Antonia cleverly maneuvered with a battalion of troops and steered the procession straight into the citadel. The Judean escort ran off and went to wail in the temple. Again, I have to stress that these contributions were being made by true Israelites all over the Greco-Roman world. The vast majority of these Israelites had no idea that the kingdom had been usurped by Edomites. Within an hour, the whole of Jerusalem turned out, shouting and screaming. They even beat the walls of Antonia with their fists. This time, however, I had no intention of letting them demonstrate for days. I had about 1,000 men in plain clothes mixed with the crowd, many of them regulars from the districts, so that they were not easily detected among the Judeans. Then I came out on the tower and announced that the money was going to be used for the aqueduct, which was to supply water to the city and to every citizen, and asked them to disperse. They answered with curses upon Rome and upon the governor. Probably they hoped to repeat the farce by which they had tricked me at Caesarea. But my commandant gave a signal, and the plainclothes men did their job swiftly and well. In some 15 minutes the crowd had fled, but for a few stubborn fanatics. Caiaphas and Annas informed me that they were going to send a delegation to Rome, but so did I. Indeed, I sent strict orders to all ports that the Judean delegation should be delayed till my courier had a vantage of at least 2 stages. Moreover, I knew that the contractors had judiciously sent the usual propitiatory gifts to Sejanus and his friends in Rome. So the aqueduct was completed and paid for in good Judean money, with some to spare. The only other incident I remember was when the work had been pushed almost to the pool of Siloam, and the tower there fell and killed some 20 men. The rabbis immediately announced that it was due to the wrath of God at the violation of the temple money. But I know that many of the foreign Judeans visiting Jerusalem having praised me warmly for having built such a grand aqueduct. They disapproved, of course, of my having used temple money. But the aqueduct will endure long after the trouble over the money is forgotten. Also, the Judeans of Jerusalem now find it beneficial, but they feel no gratitude. It was again the Jewish feast of the Passover, and my duties took me again to Jerusalem, when one evening during my stay in the city I had a visit from Nicodemus, who told me a strange story. Nicodemus was a wealthy gentleman, a banker by trade, with banking houses at Caesarea and Alexandria and also at Rome. He was, moreover, one of the very few men among the Judeans of the leading classes whom I was always glad to meet. I do not know why, in a land so encumbered with ritualism and tradition, he bore the Greek name of Nicodemus, yet he belonged to the ruling class, and was therefore one of the foremost Judeans both in their religious and political world. In sentiment and party he was a Pharisee, but in private life he was, as I have already mentioned, connected with big business and banking, and this probably gave him a more tolerant outlook on things in general. It was, as I said, the time of the great festival, and the city was crowded with pilgrims and visitors. Incidents and small disturbances were plentiful in such days, but the troops had orders not to interfere unless I received a special request from the Judean authorities. I had already seen in the confidential police reports that some unusual disturbance had occurred the previous day near one of the temple gates, but nothing had come from it in any official way. Instead, Nicodemus came to talk to me about this very episode. I must explain that on both sides of the east gate of the temple there used to be stalls for the money changers, who were permitted to set up their tables for the convenience of the pilgrim. For some 3 weeks before the feast, the money changers were permitted to ply their trade in the precincts of the temple. Purchasers of materials for votive offerings paid the amount at a special booth to an officer of the temple and received a leaden check, which they exchanged for what they had bought from the sellers, like a poker chip. Lard in Las Vegas. Large sums, moreover, were being changed to be cast in free offerings into one of the 30 chests which formed the treasury of the temple. Every Jew, no matter how poor, was required to pay yearly a shekel as atonement money for his soul and for the support of the temple. This obliged him, as I have already said, to obtain the temple shekels from the money changers who plied their trade in the outer court. Again, this money changer arrangement was never established until the Edomite Jews took over the country. The temple shekel was a coin bearing on one side a chalice-shaped pot of manna with the Phoenician letter F, Aleph, or another inscribed above it to indicate the year of government, and around it, in Samaritan characters, were the words shekel of Israel, surrounded by a beaded circle, while on the reverse there was Aaron's rod budding with almond blossoms, and the words Jerusalem the Holy. It was a rough coin in comparison with the beauty of design and minting of our Roman coinage. The trade gave the opportunity to a ready business, for 5% exchange premium was charged, and the changers were very well versed in all the tricks and chicanery of every money changer the world over. In fact, the changers had such a bad name that their witness could not be taken before the court. Well, they were Edomites, not Judahites. What had happened that morning was that a young man who entered the temple with a small following had remained a few minutes gazing around the stalls. Then he had advanced to the tables of the changers and had overturned them. Oh no! Saying that he would not allow his father's house to be so polluted. Well, we all know who did that. The man was totally unknown, a young fellow from Galilee, and he had no formal authority to interfere, for the temple arrangements were under the priests alone. But what was strange about the episode, said Nicodemus, was that the authorities appeared to have been no less stupefied than the crowd and the money changers themselves, and instead of taking measures, they had contented themselves with asking the young man what he meant by acting thus and by calling the temple his father's house. And the man had answered the rabbis in the style that the rabbis were wont to do, that is, enigmatically, quote, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up," unquote. All this, I confess, had very little meaning for me. Indeed, it sounded no better than one of the only too frequent cases of prophecy mania that flourished like weeds in that country. But Nicodemus was deeply impressed, and his tale, when I heard of it, left me most puzzled. Nicodemus had taken the trouble to inquire into the matter and had discovered what the young man was already in the way of being quite a celebrity among certain classes. His name was Jesus, quite a common name among the Judeans of the lower classes, and he was the son of an elderly carpenter named Joseph, living at Nazareth, and of a youngish mother named Mary. The man, Jesus, was a little over 30, and so far no one in Jerusalem had heard anything about him. But in his native province, Galilee, he seemed to be quite a celebrity. Nicodemus had also found out that there was a strange story surrounding his birth. Had I ever heard, Nicodemus asked, of a certain unpleasant episode which had occurred towards the very end of Herod the Great's life, when in one of his fits of madness he had ordered all the children of the district of Bethlehem and Nazareth to be slain. The murder of the innocents, the people had called it. It had occurred just about 30 years ago, and it seemed that mad deed of Herod's was connected with the birth of this fellow Jesus. There was, Nicodemus said, another most curious story about the young man's mother. There were many in Galilee who swore that the woman Mary, when betrothed to the carpenter Joseph, had received a quote-unquote visitation by an archangel, who told her in so many mystic words that she was highly favored by the Lord, and that the Spirit of God would come upon her and make her the mother of a son who would one day be the long-expected Messiah. Stories such as this, Nicodemus said, had been often heard in Judea, and the populace simply thrived upon them. And I could but answer Nicodemus that we too in Rome have had in the past many similar legends of men being descended from the favors of God to a woman, and that our imperial house itself claims divine descent from Venus, and that Greece was full of such instances of mesalliances between gods or goddesses and terrestrial beings. Be that as it may, I am prepared neither to accept nor to deny the possibility of such things, and considering that men of all ages have believed it to be quite possible and true, including our own folk in Rome, despite the decline of our religious faith, and such as seemed semi-divine men and women as Achilles and our own Romulus have existed in real life, I can record the legend of this fellow Jesus at its face value, and recognize that subsequent events did show the man Jesus to be certainly endowed with extraordinary qualities. The child, Nicodemus said, was born while his parents were on a journey to report to the district town for the census that was being taken of the population of the whole empire. Everyone who was not living in a district town had to do this, Nicodemus recalled, and I could not but smile, for I knew only too well that Augustus had a mania for methodical inquiries. He was so meticulous in these matters that he wrote with his own hand a summary of the statistics of the whole empire, which he had called Breviarium Imperii, and which included the citizens and allies in arms in all of the kingdoms and provinces, together with a long specification of their tribute and taxes. 3 separate surveys of the empire were taken for such fiscal and military ends. One in the year 726 of Rome, another in 753, and one more in 767. The man Jesus, I told Nicodemus, must have been born at the time of the second census in 753, which was taken in Judea by Sulpicius Quirinius. I might add that the method of census in Judea, as a matter of expediency, was left to Herod, as my predecessor was only too acquainted with the Judean reluctance to anything like a general enumeration, let alone the taxation to which the census was designed to lead. Of course, Herod was an Edomite, forcing the Judahites to submit to the taxes. The consensus, therefore, or rather the census, therefore, took the form of a simple registration on the old Hebrew plan for enrolling by families in their ancestral districts. Thus it was that the carpenter Joseph, who claimed, like a great many other Judeans, to descend from King David, reported to Bethlehem. The slaying of the children by Herod was the result of another legend associated with the birth of this child. It had been rumored that about the time a star of great brightness appeared in the eastern sky. This star was observed by the astrologers of Persia. And some weeks later, 3 magi arrived at Bethlehem and said they had come to pay veneration to a divine child who had just been born. I told Nicodemus that we in Rome also had quite a sprinkling of Persian magi, and that many people in Rome seriously believed that these Persian astrologers had a special knowledge of the 5 stars called planets, which predict things to come. As a matter of fact, I told him nearly all the magicians, dream expounders, and sorcerers to be found in Rome are Judahites. They seem quite skilled in the mysterious combinations of letters and numbers, which they use as talismans and amulets to heal the sick and drive away evil spirits, and bring frightful curses upon enemies. They also know how to cast horoscopes from the numerical value of the name or from some positions of the stars at a person's birth. Now, it must be recalled that these are the Judahites of the 10 northern tribes who had been very much paganized, going all the way back to the split between the house of Judah and the house of Israel circa 900 BC. I remember that we chatted quite a while that day about the influence and significance of the stars, and I told him of the hairy star which at the death of Caesar had been over the matter. After my conversation with Nicodemus in Jerusalem, I had thought it wiser to give orders to my intelligence to keep an eye on the man. His religious preaching did not interest me, yet religious questions in Judea had such a knack of taking suddenly a political turn, and soon plentiful reports had begun to come in, at times of a startling nature. Two things I had earmarked for filing: the peculiar way the man had of preaching. It was not so much a fierce style of speech, but a tone of self-confidence, of allowing no interruptions, almost as if he thought no one should contradict him. The other was that wherever he went, from village to village, there was in the crowd a small group of spies sent by the Sanhedrin from Jerusalem. Okay, so it is obvious here that Nicodemus was a true full-blooded Judahite. And the rest of the Sanhedrin, although Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin as well, but he was not in Jerusalem very often. So the Sanhedrin spied on him because those Sanhedrin were Edomites. Let's continue. It was clear that the temple priests were growing considerably alarmed at the excitement the man seemed to be arousing. The worst aspect of all was, according to the reports of my intelligence, that the man was denouncing more and more the priests of Jerusalem, and that the people seemed to drink in his words and rejoice at his scathing attacks against the ruling class. Now, obviously, now here he's talking about Jesus and not Nicodemus. So he failed to mention that after leaving off on the subject of Nicodemus, he's now talking about Jesus. There was no doubt that the fellow was heading straight for trouble, not from us, for I did not care a hoot if he had aroused the whole of Judea against the Sanhedrin and the priestly caste. A very good thing if it did happen, for we could then at least take over the complete administration of the country and do away with all the squabbles that make the governor a poor wretch, constantly obliged to watch his steps lest he should violate some agreement with the priestly caste. But it was certain that the priests in Jerusalem would not stand for long such dangerous preaching. The report said that the man's slogan was, quote, "A better time is coming," unquote. I hope so. Well, there was nothing new in that. The populace of all countries are always ready to believe that there are better times ahead, and who is to pay for the better times but the upper classes? We have a saying in Rome, quote, "Get out of your job that I will take your place," unquote. And the poor Jewish folks seem to have an unbounded faith in the better times promised by the fellow Jesus. One day, shortly before, I had dined with Nicodemus during a visit he had paid to his banking house at Caesarea. And he had told me that people in many places called Jesus the King of Israel. Quote, "Well, let them," I said. "One day he will appoint himself high priest instead of Caiaphas, and perhaps he will get rid of Annas." But Nicodemus answered, quote, "No, he will never get so far. Don't you see that by calling him a king, the crowd make him a marked man in the eyes of the Sanhedrin? And he seems to know it, for he is angry with the crowds for calling him king," unquote. Quote, "You see," Nicodemus had told me, "the man is working the people of Galilee to a high pitch of feeling, and Galilee has always nursed a grudge against Jerusalem. They would rise if Jesus should tell them to rise, and it would be most foolish to do so, for all Jerusalem would disapprove of it, and the Sanhedrin would call upon you to put down the revolt," unquote. I had looked at him half startled, and yet I thought that he was right. I knew that Nicodemus was speaking in full frankness, for he was a most decent man, and I liked him because I always felt I could discourse with him and be sure that he was not speaking with his tongue in his cheek, like the sneering Caiaphas, for all his politeness and polish. Nicodemus had said something else that had puzzled me considerably. Quote, "This man Jesus attracts men even if he leaves people like ourselves merely puzzled. Also, he has performed strange cures, and people are beginning to talk loudly of miracles, and he seems to be a very good man, good in his life and in his thoughts. So at least I hear. If only he would leave the priests alone instead of attacking the whole system upon which the very life of the people rests." Unquote. I asked Nicodemus how the man would be situated vis-a-vis the civil power. Quote, "It gets rather entangled for him," Nicodemus answered. "You see, he has been all over the place and preached in all the territories. In Galilee he runs the risk of being arrested by Antipas, and in the other territory he may have Herod Philip lay hands on him. And from Jerusalem the Sanhedrin are watching him as a cat watches a mouse, and any one of them may put the case in your hands." So I brooded over the man Jesus, and I was thinking that his case was very similar to that of the other prophet John, who had now been taken into protective custody by Herod Antipas. I had, some considerable time before, received the report that a man had taken up preaching in the region of the lower Jordan, and people were flocking to see him, and many were fired by his words. And the rabbis in Jerusalem were, as always, growing restless and fearing serious disturbances. The man, John by name, hailed from some uncertain place presumed to be Hebron. He seemed to remember that he was supposed to be the son of a priest, and that his birth too, according to popular rumor, had been connected with some sort of miracle. The man was now in his 30s and had joined a colony of hermits or anchorites living in the desert who called themselves the Essenes. They claimed to live apart from the corruption of the world and in strict accordance with the Judean or Judahite law of defilement. So here we see that Pontius Pilate is confirming the history depicted in the Gospels 100%. And of course, he actually sympathizes with the people against the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees. Very good. Let's continue. Certainly there was no better way of avoiding the corruption of the world than to go and live in a desert, and these Essenes had mostly settled in colonies in the upper valley of En-Gedi, which was very well suited for the monkish life that they had chosen. Traveling through the district between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, one came here and there upon such settlements in the narrow shady wadis, which sink in the great number from the stony plateau. They were, these hermits, the very acme of holiness. The priests in the temple of Jerusalem washed their hands and feet before any sacred rite, but the Essenes bathed their whole bodies in cold water before every meal. Also, they bathed every morning before uttering the name of God, and in this respect they were certainly the cleanest of Judahites. They did not eat meat at all, and their normal food was the one prescribed to others for fasting. It seems that in their religious ideas and ways they had borrowed freely from Persia and Greece, and the learned among them gave themselves to metaphysical speculation. Every morning they paid homage to the sun, and they would not let the rays of the sun fall on anything which they considered unclean. Again, this goes back to the idea that the sun is put there by Yahweh God, and therefore is to be honored, not worshipped, but honored. The man John had chosen for his preaching the spring of En-Gedi. I remember visiting it once. It was a place of impressive desolation. The spring, which is clear and drinkable, although rather warm, gushes from beneath the rocks of a small plateau some 400 feet above the Dead Sea. Thence the streams flow in a long cascade over the steep face of the cliff. Beneath is the blue water of the Dead Sea, and above rise the tall crags and castellated precipices of the great rock wall which runs to the fortress of Masada, some 1,500 feet above the Dead Sea, while to the east, far beyond the gorges of the Arnon, are the white towers of Kerak. The town of En-Gedi was the only inhabited spot on the whole district, and somewhere in the chasm leading down to the spring was the colony of the Essenes, which this man John had joined. The reports I had read about the man described him as a strange, long-haired creature garbed in a burnous of rough cloth made of coarse camel hair, and over his head wore the usual triangular piece of cloth kept in place by a cord. His only food, it was said, were the locusts found among the bare hills and the honey that the wild bees left in the clefts of the rocks. About the locusts, I should say that they are quite a common food for the poor and the Arabs of those parts. I have been told that the Arabs throw them alive into boiling salted water, and after a few minutes they take them out and let them dry in the sun. The head, legs, and wings are then torn off and the bodies cleansed from the salt. Then the bodies are fried in butter or spread on unleavened bread mixed with butter. I have been assured by travelers that in this manner the locusts are quite palatable. Whether the man John fried them or ate them raw for greater penance, or dipped them into honey as we do with dried plums, I cannot say. But this man was not content with his extraordinary mode of life, and that is where the trouble lay. He had come out of his retreat, and had chosen the shores of the lower Jordan, at a spot some 2 hours east of Jericho, and 8 or 9 hours from Jerusalem, where the river flows swiftly towards the Dead Sea, which is in sight. I had not seen the place myself, but I was told that the river at that spot runs through a most barren landscape, and above it is a plain some 12 miles in breadth, flanked on the west by bare hills, and on the east side it stretches to the hills of Perea, which are some 2,000 feet in height. It seems it is at this point that the once famous city of Sodom stood, destroyed by the volcanic force that the Judeans describe as an instrument of the wrath of God. Surely a most unattractive spot for preaching a new religion. One curious and somewhat attractive feature of this man John's mission was what he called baptism, and it consisted of the immersion of the convert into the waters of the river. I must, however, explain that bathing in the Jordan had been for the Judahites for long a symbolic act, but this total immersion, including the head, was considered a new thing, and it seemed to exercise an immense fascination upon the Judahites, because the Edomites would not be interested in such an immersion, probably because they are so averse to bathing. Okay, there were poor Judahites too. But the fellow was not content with giving a free bath to his converts. In a cavernous voice, he proclaimed that the Messiah was at hand. Soon the temple authorities in Jerusalem, with the jealousy of all ecclesiastical bodies towards those outside their pale, grew uneasy, and so did Herod Antipas, who had approached me officially with a request to have the man arrested, lest, he said, we found ourselves confronted with sedition. In all truth, Herod was incensed not on my account or on Rome's, but because John had attacked him as the acme of perversity and scandal. The district of Perea was included in the kingdom of Herod, and I had no alternative but to send a platoon of soldiers and police northward to the Jordan, to apprehend this man John and deliver him to Herod. And Herod had him imprisoned in the fortress of Machaerus, to which I was now journeying. What was it that made prophets so plentiful in Judea and so popular? The whole of Palestine seemed to me to be suffering from prophet mania. It was certainly strange coincidence that prophecies came also from other lands, for the Egyptian priests had announced that a phoenix had once more been seen, the bird that they regarded as the mythological emblem of the sun and as the symbolic of the cycles of world history, appearing at regular intervals to consume itself and rise anew from its ashes in mystic indication that one great period is ending and another beginning. Indeed, the phoenix had appeared under Sesostris, under Amasis, and was last seen under Ptolemy, the one, I mean, who was the third king of the Macedonian dynasty. That it should again appear now seemed strange, as the intervals of its return had hitherto been 1,461 and 500 years respectively, and it was only 250 since Ptolemy. Yet we all remember that the prophecy was confirmed in Rome by our sacred college of augurs. Indeed, I can recall having read in our Diurna, which my bookseller used to send to me in batches by each courier, to keep me in touch with events and gossip at home, that the augurs had said that the ninth world month, with it the reign of Diana, had closed with Caesar's death, and the new world month, that of Apollo, had begun. Many people in Rome and in Athens recounted that Pan had died on the day our dear Emperor Tiberius had come to the throne. That's interesting. Many travelers from Greece had told what we now regard as a well-worn but still repeated legend. A ship went off Corfu, was strangely becalmed, and forthwith the Egyptian helmsman by the name of Thammus, Thammus, had heard a loud voice from the Echinadian islands call him by name and bid him to say to all when he got to Pelodus that Pan the great god was dead. The Egyptian did as he was bidden, but scarcely had he called out his message over the shore when there arose all around a great sighing and a sound as of wonder that filled the passengers with awe. And the story, when it was told in Rome, had troubled Tiberius, and the people were not a little. Herod Antipas was king of Galilee in the northwest and of Perea in the southeast of the country, separated by the territory of the free towns known as Decapolis, Philadelphia, Gadara, Hippos, Damascus, Raphana, Dio, Pella, Gerasa, and Canatra, which we had confederated with Scythopolis in the league of peace and war against the Bedouin hordes. This made them virtually a distinct state. I had visited Gerasa on the caravan road through the mountains, and it was quite a beautiful city, with baths, temples, circus, and forum, and colonnades strangely adorning the streets mile after mile, and all the streets built at right angles. Philadelphia was some 25 miles south of Gerasa, and the Kadara there were sulphurous baths, and the city had been rebuilt by Pompey with splendid basalt-paved streets, with colonnades of Corinthian pillars and some massive buildings in Roman style. Herod kept his capital at Gennesareth because he had grown tired of Sepphoris, probably because the people of the hills of Galilee were too independent. His new capital was near the hot springs of Emmaus, in the finest part of his territories, and it possessed a certain beauty of landscape. He had planned the new city in Roman style, and as under Augustus every third town in the provinces was called Caesarea or Sebaste, the Greek equivalent of Augustus, Antipas had called the new city Tiberias. It was on the lake, on southerly bend of the shore, but I was told that the reedy strand made it unhealthy, and still worse, traces of an old burial place were found as the streets were being laid out, a discovery which at once made the rabbis proclaim the town unclean and unholy. Herod paid no attention, and as soon as the houses were ready he filled the town with whatever strangers were willing to take up residence. This is absolute proof that Herod was not a Judahite, but an Edomite Jew. I have heard it said that he had at last to use force to get inhabitants for his new capital, for no strict Judahite would settle there, and he was driven to giving slaves and beggars buildings and garden ground, and to raising houses for them, and granting them special privileges, so to populate his new and unlucky capital. He had built for himself a sumptuous palace, with gilded ceilings and wonderful candelabras and furniture to dazzle the eyes, and he had, I remember having seen it once, a whole table service of solid silver. but people in other districts used to smile whenever Tiberias was mentioned, and say sarcastically that along the waterfront of the city only beggars took the air amidst columns of granite and costly porphyry. Here again we see that the people of Judah utterly resented Herod and his pagan ways. Let's continue. The Sea of Tiberias, on the shores of which the city stood, was called the Eye of Galilee. And on the plain of Gennesareth, all the fruits of Palestine abounded. The region was indeed quite pleasant, for the hills were covered with cypresses, oaks, almonds, figs, cedars, citrons, olives, myrtles, palms, and many balsam plants. Oleander bushes, with their flowers of the loveliest colors, and waving palms adorned the promenade and gave charm to the gardens on the hills. The whole region was rich and pleasant, surrounding the pear-shaped lake, and the climate was almost a perpetual spring. The products were mainly agricultural: wheat, wine, and olive oil. The town of Magdala had a flourishing trade in doves for the sacrifices. There were no fewer than 300 shops devoted to this trade. In the neighborhood there were indigo plantations, and the dyeing trade was excellent, kept going by the industries of Arbela, a well-known textile center. Flax was also grown widely, and the women wove with it the finest linen that found a good market in Rome. Kepher Hananiah was the pottery district, and it was there that we Romans learnt to make the huge jars for preserving olive oil, which were such an improvement on the amphoras that we use for wine, and which, because of their pointed bases, must be kept all the time planted in the ground, which is not always convenient. I also remember the smoking chimneys of the glass factories which used the glistening white sand of the seashore. The peculiarity of Galilee was that it had always had, it seems, a mixed population, and this may be the origin of the curious proverb, quote, "The Galilean loves honor, and the Jew loves money." I also heard that it was in this region that the very beautiful Jewish poem, which they call the Song of Songs, of course it's the Judahite poem of Israel, the Song of Songs, was composed. Those Judahite kings, however, were not the most desirable of friends, although Herod Antipas was of a peace-loving disposition. Herod Antipas was a half-breed. He had been educated at Rome, where he was sent with his full brother Archelaus and his half-brother Philip to join their half-brother Antipater, who was already in Rome to receive his education and to propitiate Augustus. And Antipas had remained in Rome after Archelaus and Philip had been recalled to Judea. He had received the name of Antipas in honor of his paternal great-grandfather, as Antipater, his half-brother, had received that of his grandfather. Herod Antipas had entered on his government, or reign, as they proudly called it, when he was 17, in the year 4 B.C., and at first had kept his capital at Sepphoris, some 2 hours' travel from Nazareth. He had rebuilt it, for the city had been burned to the ground by the proconsul Varus in the summer of the year 4, when Varus had to march against it from the garrison town of Ptolemais to put down an insurrection. Later he had built for himself the new capital, which he flatteringly called Tiberias, and to keep friendly with Tiberius he had made use of one of Tiberius's weaknesses, that was to maintain through local kings a watch on the proconsuls and governors. In the summer he was fond of taking up residence at Machaerus, which I had not yet visited. People had described it to me as at one time stupendous and awe-inspiring. It was also called the Diadem, because it was seated like a crown on the high peaks on the east side of the Dead Sea, almost on a line with the town of Bethlehem. The fortress had been originally raised by another Judahite king, Alexander Jannaeus, I think, but Gabelus had destroyed it in his war against Aristobulus. Antipas had restored the castle as a former defense. And I remember that it appeared to me both strange and impressive that when I arrived within sight of it, The fortress was built among the volcanic cliffs and peaks of Perea, where the desolate region bordered with the Nabatean kingdom and was exposed to the Arabs, about halfway down the eastern edge of the Dead Sea. Antipas had built a small city surrounded by walls and towers, and from it a path led up to the citadel on the top of the hill, at the very end of a narrow ridge. At the other end of the height he had raised a great wall, with corner towers 200 feet high, and with the space between there was a great palace, with rows of magnificent monolithic columns, halls lined with many-colored marbles, stupendous baths, not omitting barracks, and everything needed in case of a siege. And as Antipas was not a man to trust to strong walls alone, and because he dreaded the neighboring prince Aretas as his most probable enemy, he had allied himself with Aretas by marrying his daughter. In his fortress palace Herod used to take up residence from time to time, abandoning himself to revelry, so that rumor went. And in the dungeons of this stronghold he had now imprisoned the prophet John. It was one of the strangest imprisonments I can remember. Herod had obtained from me the man's arrest with the avowed intention of putting him to death for seditious propaganda. On the other hand, he was keeping him in captivity as though he was afraid to do away with him. And the strangest of it all was that the people from the towns below and from all over Palestine not only kept watch outside the gates of the prison, but they were allowed to have intercourse with the prisoner and brought him news from the outer world, amongst which was the report, only too true, that another man had commenced preaching in Galilee, a man he had baptized in the Jordan, Jesus by name. Now and then, I was told, Herod had the man brought up from his dungeon to show him off to his guests at his banqueting table. Beneath that stronghold, unscalable precipices sank to the deep valleys below. In the hidden hollows of the gorges, luxuriant palms grew and fiery flowers bloomed. Masses of lava and black basalt made the rocks look like iron mountains, while hot sulfur springs gushed from the clefts of the rocks, sending up a thick mist of steam. I did not like the place, and even less did I like the company. Still, I had to put up with it, and I was only too glad that Procula was not with me, for Herod was at the time deep in one of those passionate and lustful intrigues which seemed to be the eternal pastime and the curse of those Jewish, that is, Judean, Edomite Jew monarchs. The disgraceful affair had lasted already some 3 years, while the whole family of Herod had gathered at Jerusalem for one of the feasts. Antipas had met there Herodias, the wife of his half-brother Herod Boethus, also called Herod Philip, son of Herod the Great, and of the second Mariamne, a woman who had been famous for her beauty. Mariamne was, of course, a true Judahite, and very much white. Herodias was herself granddaughter of Herod Philip and of the first Mariamne, the daughter of Aristobulus, one of Mariamne's murdered sons. This Herod Philip had therefore married his granddaughter. But this was nothing strange in the Herod family. It happened that Antipas, being guest of his half-brother Philip, fell passionately in love with his sister-in-law. Herodias had been married to Philip when he was already approaching 50, and she had, as her only child, a daughter named Salome, who was married to another Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and brother of Antipas. Herodias herself, the mother of the girl Salome, was a woman of no more than 34 or 35. Herodias was an ambitious woman. She was also a half-breed, or either that or a full-blooded Edomite. She also had many grievances, for her husband, who had once been named the great Herod's heir, had been cancelled from the will of his mother after was detected in a plot. Herodias was therefore ready to intrigue with her crowned brother-in-law, and she agreed to marry him once he had divorced his wife, who, as I have already mentioned, was the daughter of Aretas, a Nabatean king whose domains adjoined those of Antipas on the south, with Petra for capital. Antipas had indeed undertaken a journey to Rome to secure the imperial consent to this arrangement, but his wife, the daughter of Aretas, had spared him any difficulty regarding the divorce. Knowing of her husband's relations with Herodias, she asked permission to visit the border fortress of Machaerus, whose hot springs were in a great repute as a health resort. From there, her father, Aretas, had her carried off, and she was conducted by Arab sheiks to her family palace at Petra, where her father declared her marriage annulled. Whereupon Herodias immediately left her grandfather husband and came to live with Antipas at Tiberias. But the incestuous marriage had borne bitter fruits. The union remained childless, which was considered by the Jews as a curse. The father of the repudiated wife brought a war against Antipas, who was so shamefully defeated that he had to appeal to us for aid. And to make his position still more unhappy, this fellow John had touched his conscience to the quick by his denunciations and prophecies, and by calling curses upon the meretricious Herodias. This situation was quite well known to me. The only thing that I had failed to understand was why Antipas delayed so long in ridding himself of the noisome prophet. As I have said, the occasion of the invitation to visit Antipas at Machaerus was the anniversary of his ascension to the throne. Every summer he used to make the anniversary an occasion of great festivity, and he always gave a banquet to which the officers in attendance at Machaerus were invited, together with the sheiks of the neighboring tribes and the high society within reach, Roman and Jewish. The palace windows were brilliantly illumined, and hung with garlands and flowers, and the table spread with every luxury. On this particular occasion the mirth and rejoicing ran high. Herodias herself was not present, for the woman never took part in the festivities of men. Plural, the women never took part in the festivities of men. But to do honor to the company, her daughter Salome had condescended to dance before Antipas and his guests. Dancing at banquets was no less fashionable in the East than it has been in Rome, since Augustus brought it into vogue. It was, however, utterly unusual for a lady of royal lineage to perform before strangers. Salome's ballet was certainly a great success, and her dress was planned to show the beauty of the performer's body to the greatest advantage. The guests were charmed, and Antipas, flushed with wine, promised the dancer with true Eastern exaggeration to give her anything she might ask, even should it be half his kingdom, although he could not give away the humblest of his villages without permission from Tiberius Caesar. The girl Salome bowed to him and begged leave to retire and consult her mother. When she returned to the banqueting hall, she asked to be given the head of John the Baptist. It was a gruesome request, but also a cunning one. More than one guest smiled slyly or bowed his head to cover a sneer. Antipas looked startled at his beautiful stepdaughter, who was still arrayed in the veils of the dance. Then, probably feeling that he had compromised himself before the company, he motioned to a soldier of the guard and commanded him to bring the prisoner's head. Presently the head of the man was brought in on a salver, and presented to Salome. Without the flicker of an eye, the girl took the salver in her arms and brought it out to her mother. No one spoke. Antipas signaled to the servants. The cymbals were sounded, and the banquet proceeded. I had never seen any feast a more disgusting lack of taste. The following year, shortly before the weekend preceding the annual feast of the Passover, I arrived in Jerusalem and took up residence in the palace. Soon the commander of the garrison in Antonia informed me that we were to expect disturbances. Nor was I greatly surprised. Reports had been reaching me for many months that the man Jesus had made great strides with his preaching, and his followers could now be counted as a multitude. He had now been preaching for about 2 years, and one had to admit that he had steadily gained in popular favor in spite of the terrific efforts of the hierarchical priesthood to check him. His claims and his activities had indeed become the engrossing topic of the day. There had also been extraordinary stories of miracles. I am, myself, rather skeptical about preternatural happenings, and it was indeed a long time since anything of that sort was seen in Rome or anywhere else for that matter. Yet I had heard the deeds of this man reported as genuine by persons who would have rather preferred to discount them. Stories of healing I did not consider of great importance, for the world has always been full of both magical healers and of invalids ready to be cured at the merest touch of the healer's hands. But there were other stories that either required to be discounted forthwith or else investigated. Not long before, it seemed that the man had done something truly amazing at some quiet spot on the lake of Tiberias, somewhere near Bethsaida, which means fish house, a village recently enlarged and beautified by Philip, tetrarch of Iturea, who had erected some buildings in the Greek style and called the place Bethsaida Julius, in honor of the beautiful but ill-famed daughter of Augustus. The man Jesus was there, I had heard, with his habitual escort of disciples, and a great crowd had assembled, as was now usual wherever he went. It was towards evening, and the company showed no signs of dispersing. Food could not be had in that lonely spot, and his disciples, afraid of this, urged him to send the crowd away. But he told them that the crowd must be fed. It would not do to dismiss them hungry. And he told his disciples to make the multitude sit down, and to divide it into groups of 50s and 100s. And he took some bread and fishes the disciples had with them, and looking up to heaven, blessed the food and proceeded to hand portions to the disciples, who passed them to the crowd. And with 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fishes he fed, people said, 5,000 men and women and children, and there were many baskets left over. And of course, I must here interject, this letter of Pontius Pilate totally confirms the Gospels. Let's continue. Now, were those people mad in imagining that they had been fed? Or was this man Jesus really a person of supernatural powers? Strangely, they obviously were mad, right? Strangely enough, I remember reading in one report that after this extraordinary feat, the man seemed suddenly to have become afraid of the enthusiasm of the people, and had hastily bidden his disciples to embark with him on their boat, crossing the lake in the direction of Capernaum. For the crowd on the shore was acclaiming him a true prophet and the marked king of the Judahites. As I have said, he had taken to going about with a following of 12 men, who were calling themselves his disciples, quite simple folk who followed him everywhere, and now I had heard that he was beginning to send them out on their own to preach on his behalf. People called them apostles, and said that he had endowed them with the power of healing. That is, the thing was no longer merely sporadic. It was developing into a regular movement. Palestine is a queer land, completely God-mad, a real paradise for prophets and faith exploiters. But this new movement was all wrong, and it was bound to alarm the religious authorities, and also to cause concern to me, for the whole life of Palestine rested on religion, and to upset the established state of things was to upset the course of civil life. Indeed. And everything that happened concerning this man Jesus seemed to violate or even to subvert the rules by which the Jewish people, that is, the Judean people, were accustomed to abide. Again, not long ago I was told the man was asked to dine at the house of a person of good social position, named Simon, a member of the Pharisee party, who obviously wanted to show him to his guests. But while they were all in the dining hall, there came in among the couches a woman, a most extraordinary occurrence, for women could not with propriety make their appearance at such entertainments. And more extraordinarily still, this woman knelt beside the man Jesus and proceeded to wash his feet with fragrant ointment, all the time weeping in great distress, and wiping the tears from his feet with her long hair and covering his feet with kisses. Quite a spectacle, eh? The woman appeared to be a public prostitute and was quite loosely dressed and unveiled. The other guests were horrified, not only at the unseemly scene, but even more, as it was afterwards explained to me, at the idea that a man who professed to be a rabbi should allow such a woman, or indeed any woman, to approach him. It was contrary to all traditions. Yet I was told the man Jesus had turned to the weeping woman at his feet and said to her simply, quote, "Your sins are forgiven. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace," unquote. Thenceforward, a group of women had attached themselves to him besides the 12 disciples. Things such as these and many others I had heard at the time, but the details of which have fairly escaped my memory, brought about a state of tension which I could easily foresee would soon cease to be merely religious and would become political. Rumors, too, of possible action against him by Herod Antipas, under whose jurisdiction he fell, increased the difficulty of the situation. Everyone knew that this man Jesus and many of his followers had come from the school of John, whom Herod had put to death, and to Herod it was enough to hint at that man's name to send him into a frenzy. I was indeed beginning to wonder whether this man Jesus was bent on sowing the seeds of a revolution, and so did all politically minded people, not least the hierarchical parties. Already one official step towards the repression of the new movement had taken place on the occasion of the man's last visit to Jerusalem. It seems that the crowds had reported that Jesus had cured a blind man on the Sabbath day, and this in itself was considered by the priests a crime of the first magnitude. I could fill pages in setting down all the things that could not be done on the Sabbath day. To us the rules on this point seemed quite insane. To tie a camel driver's knot was unlawful, and equally it was forbidden to write 2 letters if they could be read together, although one could write them in the road dust or in the sand. It was even unlawful to attend to any sick person on such a day. So Jesus was accused by the priests of performing an unlawful act. But his answer had been, quote, "If the priest who officiates on the Sabbath is held blameless, though he is in fact breaking the holy day, what is lawful for the servant of the temple must be lawful for many servants to do on that day," unquote. Which was clever and logical, but it did not help matters, right? As Jesus said, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. The fact was, as I knew only too well, that spies sent from Jerusalem dogged his steps and noted his words and acts and reported them to the ecclesiastical authorities. They were in power and did not mean to be bothered and obstructed by such a man. Already they had been touched in their tenderest susceptibilities by the preaching of John, and they held that to go on teaching against the law was revolutionary in its deepest sense, even if the revolution was limited to the belief that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. The man Jesus was definitely heading for trouble. Of course, the real complaint that Jesus and John, the Judahites, had was that the Pharisees were writing their own law and pretending that it was Mosaic law. Indeed, the day before the celebrations at the temple began, Caiaphas, escorted by Annas, came to see me. They said they feared that Jesus would come to Jerusalem. In fact, they had reports that he meant to come with a large following. There might be trouble, they said, and it should be wiser if I would arrest him before he entered the city. I refused. What had the man done to warrant such a step on my part? And might it not happen that such a decision would bring about the very popular revolt that we were trying to avoid? His followers might say that I had laid hands on a holy Judahite. Caiaphas and Annas argued that I should make the man disappear quietly. They said that all considered it was worth the risk, A dead prophet is soon forgotten. Nevertheless, I refused. The man had done nothing whatsoever to make me side with the high priests. Things began to get lively on the Sunday. Jesus had traveled to Jerusalem, followed by a long caravan of pilgrims who had gone on increasing in number, up the wild gorge of the Kidron, coming from Jericho. But the caravan had camped the previous afternoon outside Bethany, on the western slope of the Mount of Olives, in the pleasant dell below the village, in sight of the city. Early on Sunday morning, word reached the city that Jesus was about to enter Jerusalem. Great numbers of Galilean pilgrims, I was afterwards told, forthwith set out to meet and escort him, cutting fronds from the palm trees that lined the way to do him honor. Soon he arrived, riding a donkey, which the 12 disciples had bedecked with their abbas, while the crowd strewed the leaves and fronds on the road before him, chanting all the time, "Give triumph to the Son of David." There was a special significance in this otherwise absurd entry, riding an ass. However silly it may sound, an ass was the ancient symbol of Judahite royalty. In contrast with the horse, which had been introduced by Solomon from Egypt and was used especially for war, the ass was the emblem of the peace. To the Judahite, it was a particularly national, for it was said that Moses had led his wife to Egypt seated on an ass, and it seems that some prophets had forecast that the Messiah would enter Jerusalem poor and riding an ass. People from the windows were calling, "Who is this?" And the crowd answered, "It is Jesus, the prophet of Nazareth in Galilee." The man left his beast at the temple gates and entered the precincts, declaring that he was taking possession of it in the name of God, while through the courts and halls re-echoed the shouts of Hosanna to the Son of David. I can only say at this point that this record left to us by Pontius Pilate confirms astoundingly to the actual record of the Gospels. And as we all know, Pontius Pilate tried to protect Jesus from the Jews. Yet we are told constantly that the Romans killed Christ and not the Pharisees and Sanhedrin. Folks, you have been lied to by religious authorities all over the world who claim to be Christians and Jews. All right? So, folks, this is all going to happen again. It's all going to repeat. The episode where Jesus was crucified by the Sanhedrin, namely the Edomite Jews, will become yet again a major subject of contention, because the struggle between the Jews and Christianity will resurface again, I guarantee you. Let's continue. But it seemed that the priests, though still undecided what course to pursue, and perhaps afraid of the popular feeling that any action might evoke in favor of the man, soon felt that this spontaneous entry into Jerusalem and the temple was a mistake on the part of Jesus. What happened was this. They discoursed with him throughout the day, trying to entangle him by the answers he gave to their questions. They sent obscure men who pretended themselves anxious to get his counsel on some much disputed points of the law. In this way 2 days passed. I had reports that the Sanhedrin, seated in a frequent session of their stone hall of meeting within the precincts of the temple, were kept continuously informed of what Jesus did and said. They had put to him the question of whether it was right to divorce a woman and to marry another. It was a ticklish question. Everywhere, especially in Rome, the strictness of the marriage bond has been relaxed, and divorce is the rule of the day. Gone is the time when there was no divorce for a frivolous cause. Today, ladies in Rome no longer reckon their years by the consuls, but by the number of their repudiated husbands. It was no better among the Judeans. Since polygamy had fallen into discredit, the Judeans made a near approach to it by the ease with which they could dismiss their wives. And this would apply to both Judahites and Edomites, a husband among the Judeans could divorce his wife at any time and for any cause, he being himself the sole judge. All that was needed was the concurrence of 3 rabbis and their approval in writing, on vellum, containing neither more nor less than 12 lines, the eternal hypocrisy of their ritualism even in immortality. Yes, total hypocrisy, because Jesus pronounced the only cause for which you can divorce your wife is fornication, some sort of sexual, disturbance. But it was clear that the Pharisees meant by this question to bring Jesus into conflict with Herod Antipas. Very perceptive by Pontius Pilate here. Some little time previously, news had run high in Jerusalem that Jesus had resurrected a dead man called Lazarus. The man had already been in his tomb 4 days. It was one of those graves belonging to the wealthier Judeans, formed of a recess hewn horizontally into the rock, with a slab or mass of stone to close the entrance. Jesus had made the relatives remove the slab, and when the grave was uncovered, he had stood at the entrance and cried, quote, "Lazarus, come forth," unquote. And the dead man had risen, swathed in his ghastly garments, with a napkin round the head which had upheld the jaw, bound hand and foot and face, and he had walked forth. I was told that that day the Sanhedrin had met in the spirit of great perplexity, and I could well believe it. The miracle was true. It could not be denied. Who was there to prevent the populace from calling him a holy prophet and their king? Caiaphas sent me several reports. He liked to word them like foreign office notes. Some read like preces, others like mere notes verbales, but always so formal, like communications of an ambassador from one power to another. He would have made me laugh had he not been so cunning and damn clever. Of course, I knew quite well what was in the mind of the Sanhedrin. The priests feared that, should a popular disturbance occur, Rome might intervene militarily and put an end to the political existence of a theocracy that had proved unable to prevent such heresies and revolutionary disturbances. The deliberations of the Sanhedrin were usually kept very secret, but that day some news percolated to me. It was that Caiaphas had told the Sanhedrin that the only solution was to sacrifice one victim. Indeed, this fiat of Caiaphas, uttered in the secrecy of the Sanhedrin, became instantly known throughout Jerusalem. Now bear in mind that Mosaic law forbade the sacrifice of a human being. Any human being. Only animals could be sacrificed. Was the news deliberately spread to impress the people, or me? I wondered. On the Tuesday, the priest put to Jesus this question, quote, "Is it lawful for us to pay tribute to Caesar or not? Is it in accordance with the allegiance we owe to God as king to recognize any other king as we do if we pay taxes to Caesar?" It was on a similar reasoning that some 20 years before my time, Judas the Gaulonite had based his fierce revolt against payment of the tax demanded after the census of Quirinius. And his name was still venerated by the closely packed multitude that now stood around Jesus awaiting his answer. In fact, every Judean expected from Jesus a stern avowal of the illegality of the demand for taxes. The man answered, quote, "Bring me the coin you pay as the Roman tax," unquote. A denarius was presently brought to him, a coin which the Judeans hated intensely, for it was the coin in which the poll tax was paid. Moreover, they considered idolatrous the image of Tiberius on the coin and the words of his authority. The man Jesus said, "Whose image and superscription is this?" They answered, "Caesar's." "Then render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's," unquote. Now bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that the Judeans had been paying the Romans with this coin for now close to 100 years. Was Jesus doing any or saying anything that they hadn't been doing already? It was a clever answer, but the priests grasped at once that it introduced an entirely new conception of the relations of church and state. The church in Judea had until then been identical with the nation. Indeed, the church was the nation, and the law of that church the law of the people, the only law they admitted, for the laws of Rome were by them considered contrary to their sacred law. Even in Rome, church and state were in a certain respect identical. Caesar was Pontifex Maximus, as well as emperor. The colleges of priests and augurs were political institutions whose members were controlled by the emperor. The words of the man Jesus implied that the sphere of the state was to be considered as separate from the sphere of the conscience. The idea was certainly a menace to the recognized order of things. But beyond this, I don't think Pontius Pilate realizes that what he was saying to the Sanhedrin was, hey, you hypocrites, you've been paying your taxes with this coin. Who am I to tell you to do otherwise? He certainly put them on the spot. Continuing with Pontius Pilate, and this claim, as the Judean mind was disposed to see it, could easily be interpreted as a challenge to the emperor's authority. In the evening, Caiaphas, the high priest, informed me on behalf of the ecclesiastical college that he proposed to effect the arrest of a false Messiah, dangerous to the authority of Rome, and as he feared an attempt to rescue the man by the populace, he asked for a band of soldiers from the garrison in Antonia. In the circumstances, I could not but grant the request, as the garrison acted as police. During the night, Nicodemus called on me, and begging to be forgiven for disturbing my sleep, gave me a full report of the trial which had already taken place before the Sanhedrin. All right, ladies and gentlemen, who put Jesus on trial? The Sanhedrin or Pontius Pilate? When the soldiers had gone to arrest the man Jesus, it was quite clear, Nicodemus said, that the whole thing had been carefully planned beforehand, for the tribune who commanded the detachment of soldiers taken from Antonia was not only given the correct address of the place where the man was to be found, but supplied with a fellow who could indicate Jesus to the officer. The informer was one of the 12 men who called themselves disciples of Jesus, a former publican, Judas by name. What's a publican? A tax collector. Jews are well known as tax collectors. The prisoner was led to the house of Annas. Annas had passed him to the Sanhedrin for trial almost at once. Now remember that the high priests in these days were no longer the direct descendants of the Levites and the high priests. That was disrupted by the Romans and the Edomites under Herod. So none of these so-called high priests were legitimate. Nicodemus was able to give me an exact precis of the trial, for he was a member of the Sanhedrin. The council had been called hurriedly, and not all the 73 members were present, but it was sufficient to have an attendance of 23 for a quorum. Moreover, they had not sat in the hall Gizith, that was half within and half without the holy precincts of the temple, but in Caiaphas's house. The Sanhedrin sat in a circle, half on the right and half on the left of the president or Nazi, Caiaphas holding that office as high priest. At his right hand sat the father of the house of judgment as vice president, and at his left the Shachan or wise man. 2 scribes awaited at the table to record the sentences, and 2 officers guarded the prisoner, who stood in front of the president. I was at first not a little surprised that such a mountain should be made of a molehill, and told Nicodemus so. But listening to Nicodemus, I soon realized that the Judean hierarchy were out on a serious charge against the man. It was, I then felt, one of those cases which the priesthood would have gladly taken before the emperor himself. And so here I pause to conclude part 2 of the reading of this wonderful document, and we'll conclude it with part 3 plus an explanation of the valid points that this country called Judea at this point in time was peopled by true-blooded Judahites who obeyed the Mosaic law versus Edomites pretending to be Israelites who had taken control thanks to the Romans. This part follows. Thank you.